Hey folks, welcome to MSP Mountain. And today we have Joseph Brunsman from CPL Brokers, who is going to tell us a little bit about cybersecurity for MSPs from a legal and technical perspective. What you just told me is that there's been lots of lawsuits in the MSP space recently. So that seems like a
Yeah.
pretty juicy thing to jump off with. So why don't you tell us first a bit about your firm and what you
Mhm.
guys do, and then we can go further and explore what the landscape looks like in 2021 for MSPs navigating legal situations and what they can do to prevent that.
Sure, sure. So my brokerage is Chesapeake Professional Liability Brokers, soon to be the Brunsman Advisory Group. So that's coming up next month. So slight change in names there. And my insurance brokerage has been around for close to like 30 years at this point. And so traditionally, it was architects, engineers, lawyers, a ton of accountants, which will kind of come into play later. We're going to talk about a little bit of that. And then just because of my background, so I'm a former IT, I have a bachelor's in robotics from the Naval Academy, and then a master's in cybersecurity law from the King Carey School of Law. And for like the last 6 years, I was just really interested in tech E&O insurance, which is like what an MSP would carry, and cyber insurance, just because of my background. So there was never, I guess, until very recently, like there was never really any money in it. I just really like the topic, right? Because the other lines of insurance, when a claim comes across my desk, there's like a 90% chance I could pretty much tell you what's going to happen with that claim, right? Like the case law is established, the laws really haven't changed all that much. Like it's pretty straightforward stuff. Whereas the cyber world and the tech world, I mean, it's just this constantly dynamic, moving, sometimes insanity inducing world where there's always something new, there's always something different. There's always some legislator who probably couldn't even power on his own computer, and freaks out when the keyboard doesn't work, right? He's writing cybersecurity legislation, so it like turns into this big mess. So it's just a super cool, fascinating world, and more. I'm just helping MSPs across the country on really kind of a number of things. So, um, one is not just like the insurance side, but also the risk management side. Right now, that those concerns have really kind of like come to the forefront, and we're seeing more claims against MSPs, as well as cyber insurance. So I also help their clients with trying to figure out what's the right cyber insurance policy for them, because as far as insurance goes, cyber insurance is like the Wild West, and there is very little expertise in that. Hence the books that I give away on that topic for free.
Great. And what does the increase in lawsuits against MSPs look like? What are some example cases that you think that would be good examples on why MSPs should get their security together, sooner rather than later?
Yeah, so we're seeing a lot of, there's kind of this misconception. We'll just say like the broader business community at large, not even MSPs, but just the broader business community, where it's, why would they come after me? I'm just like a small mom and pop shop in the Midwest, right? Wouldn't they go after a bank, JP Morgan Chase, or the federal government? And people have this misconception, and thankfully it's changing, this idea of security by obscurity, right? Where they're like, well, no one's going to come after me. They're going to go after the big guys. And the media obviously feeds that idea, because we don't see a lot of stories in we'll say the national news. You'll see it in the local news. National news is Home Depot got breached, Target got breached, like the big headline stuff. SolarWinds, the recent Microsoft Hafnium nonsense. We see that, but we don't see a lot of, at least at the national level, what's going on at kind of like the local businesses. Um, that's all changed, right? So more and more, 5 years ago, I'm like shouting into the wind about cyber insurance and tech, insurance, and like nobody cared. And then all of a sudden, everybody started caring. So I just kind of had this like passion project for the better part of a decade. And what we're seeing is the bad guys have, obviously figured out, why would I try and rob like Fort Knox, which has all the US gold in it. Like, I'm going to get shot in the face with a tank. That's not going to make sense. Like, it'd be a lot easier to rob 10 small credit unions in the local area, right? Because their security is a lot less. They just can't afford that much security. So obviously the bad guys have figured that out. An easy avenue for them to do that is they go to the MSP, they go to their RMM, right? They go to that remote management software, and then they hit all of their clients with ransomware at the same time. So it's kind of like
Wow.
a, you know, why, like why go after 10 small businesses individually now when I can just go after one MSP, hit all of their clients with ransomware. And then from there, the probability of someone paying that ransom demand goes up exponentially at
So
that point.
where are you seeing the vulnerability for MSPs? Like where do they tend to get hit? Is it the RMM? Is it lack of password security, MFA, stuff like that? Or is it just a
Mhm.
vulnerability on the stack itself?
It's kind of all over the map at this point. Because, like when we say MSP, that could mean like a million different things, right? So you could have an MSP, it's got like 60, 70 people in it, highly sophisticated, adhering to a framework. They got all, everything going on, all the bells and whistles in there, all the way down to like the sole proprietor guy who just started it, but like he's also considered an MSP.
Yeah.
So we're kind of seeing it all over the map. I think most recently we've seen a lot of vulnerability in that remote management software, like not having two-factor authentication. We've seen a lot of that recently, but I mean, we're kind of just seeing claims everywhere at this point because there's just such a variance in what is considered an MSP.
All right. So one thing they always ask me as a staffing provider for MSPs, have you ever seen any breach that came from disgruntled employees and stuff like that?
I have not seen one personally. I have spoken to an attorney who's a good buddy of mine that works in this area as well. He has absolutely seen that. Um, and I'd say, generally, I think like a lot of people who get into the technology world, one of the concerns there is that, like we love technology, but maybe we're not good with like people skills.
Hmm.
And that's kind of one of the reasons that like we're drawn to this idea, right? That like you can excel at something, but you don't have to like be on a giant stage because it, maybe it's exhausting, right? Mentally to do that for some people. So I think that threat, um, I don't necessarily think it's the preponderance of threats to MSPs, but it's definitely something that the business owner should be concerned about, right? It's kind of just like it should be a standard practice there to obviously, do background checks on your employees. At just a personal level, like make sure your guys or your gals, like make sure they're doing okay, that they're not super disgruntled, and make sure that, obviously we preach about defense in depth at the clients of MSPs, right? Every MSP is talking about that now, right? There's no silver bullet. You got to have defense in depth, multiple things to try and keep the bad guys out. I think MSPs realistically need to look at that internally as well,
Mm-hmm.
right? To make
Yeah.
sure that if for no other reason, network segmentation, user permissions, that even if bad guy comes in, from the outside, that you can at least try and limit the scope of the damage that's done there. So it's kind of good for a myriad of reasons. Only one of which would be that internal employee threat.
So what are the top sort of five things that you feel MSPs could implement now to get their house in order security wise, like internally and with their clients?
Okay, so the first thing I think that people need to do is, and this is going to sound silly, you got to have a contract. I mean, just step one, right? And that sounds really basic, but I know a lot of MSPs, they came from like the break fix model,
Yep.
where maybe a contract wasn't really that big of a deal. And so, if you don't have a contract, you're toast, frankly, because then it gets into like he said, she said, and you're just going to get tanked. Because what's going to happen is you're going to sit in front of a jury. If it even gets that far, most likely you're going to settle before then because you really have no defense. And it's going to be local business owner who's like, I didn't know anything about technology. And this guy who's the technology guy said, I'm going to be 100% safe at all times. Even though we know realistically, like, most MS, they're never going to make that assurance, right? They're never going to say like nothing's ever going to happen. But the interpretation from a non-technically inclined client could very well make that interpretation. So, baseline, make sure you have a contract, make sure it's an appropriate contract. You can always change it depending upon the needs of the client, right, throughout that year. But with that, there's kind of a couple things you need in there, which I think businesses haven't really thought about yet. And these are really what we would consider standard risk management practices in all the other industries. So one is, being very specific, working with a qualified attorney to narrow this down, actually saying like what you're doing and what you're not doing, right? And be specific about what you're not doing, right? Because that's going to help you out when a claim comes across your desk and you unfortunately have to call me more than once a year, right? Like nobody wants to talk to me more than once a year. Also, like other kind of standard business practices that you're going to see at attorneys, architects, engineers, accountants, is they're always offering a higher level of service, right? So like we know that as an MSP, part of the game is your client doesn't have unlimited funds, right? None of us business owners have unlimited funds. But part of that, like the CYA as it is, the risk management side is always offer that additional service, right? So it's the next step up in security, some additional security control. And the reason for that is if a claim comes across your desk, right? And let's say it's not your fault, well, then that's just an additional layer of defense you have. And for those ultra high risk clients, also thinking about putting in there, hey, these are the additional levels of controls that we're offering, right? Maybe additional package layers. Check here, right, to say that you've been, or initial here, that you've been appropriately advised on the risks and benefits. And if you decline these services, right, initial here, right? So now you have like an affirmative declaration that when you go to your defense attorney and you say, hey, we offered these services and they declined these services and it's in black and white and they initialed next to it and I talked to him about it, that's a much, much better position to be in than not only just, hey, we had a contract, but also we didn't even have a contract. But I promise you, Mr. Defense Attorney, that I never told them I was going to keep them 100% secure.
So what's the bare minimum what should be in the contract on the basic package rather than the premium one? What's the bare minimum that needs to be in there? What are the clauses? Of course, NDA, but then there has to be stuff about their staff and how you've trained them. And
yeah, so a lot of it's going to depend upon that specific client, like what kind of industry they're in.
So yeah, but most MSPs aren't going to write a new contract for every client they sign on, right? So
correct. So I'd recommend for that, because that starts getting really into like the technical legal side. One attorney that I usually say is a good place to go to is a guy named Don Geider out of Barley Law. There's another one, I think his name is Brad Gross.
Can you spell Geider for us?
Yeah, so his name is Don, D-O-N,
yeah,
and his last name is Geider, Geiter.
Okay.
And he is at barley.com. So BARLEY.com. And he can really start like narrowing down that specific contract language. A lot of it would also depend on, what kind of services that MSP can even offer.
Yeah.
Right. What type of clients they have, what type of industries they're in. So for example, if it's a HIPAA client here in the US, right, and they're holding health information, that is different because now you're a business associate of a covered entity under HIPAA. There's kind of different requirements there.
Sure. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, he's a good place to start. And one thing that he does that I think is absolutely brilliant and magical, and this also goes into that defense in depth for MSPs, is contractually requiring your clients to carry cyber insurance. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a bunch of very good reasons for that. Foremost is, you can't control if Becky in the accounting office of your client wires $500,000 to a bad guy.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Like, you can't control if she doesn't adhere to the internal policies of the business she's working at and she's cruising Facebook and downloads malware, right? When she's supposed to actually be working. Like you can't control that. You can't control people 24 hours a day. So what you want to do as an MSP is make sure that you're contractually requiring your clients to carry that cyber insurance, because you don't want them looking at your E&O policy every time somebody at their business does something that's against policy or is just frankly dumb and doesn't adhere to basic cyber hygiene.
So there needs to be like the definition that they have that, and they indemnify the MSP against their staff's negligence on that area.
Kind of like something in that vein.
Yeah.
There are very specific reasons why a client of an MSP would go after an MSP, right, for a claim.
Yeah.
But, one, I would just, tell those MSPs, I know a lot of them they're nervous about putting that contract language in requiring cyber insurance. But think of it this way, right? We have hundreds of other clients in other industries, and they're all getting requirements to carry cyber insurance at this point. So either that client already has cyber insurance, they're not going to care, or they're already, sitting on some other contract that's going to require cyber insurance anyways, or they're thinking about cyber insurance anyways, or it's going to come down the pike in the next month regardless. So
Yeah,
might as
and
well
at
keep it in.
least you can prove you had the conversation then. If it's in the original contract and their lawyers strike it out and say no, you guys are, you
Mhm.
can sort of like put a that's one boundary that you've set, that you guys need to control this part of your business and assume this liability, and it's not on the MSP unless it can be proved that the breach is coming from us, right? That's the,
Precisely. And, kind of the other part of it too is part of that conversation is like, hey, it's not just good for the MSP, it's good for all the clients, right? So the client of that MSP should want all the other clients to carry cyber insurance, because let's say, client A, Becky wires $500,000 to a bad guy, they sue the MSP, right? And they wipe out the E&O insurance for that MSP. Well, then business B has a legitimate claim against the MSP. There's no more insurance money there,
yeah,
right? So what are they going to go after? Like desk chairs?
yeah.
So it actually makes sense. And I made a whole video on this on my YouTube channel about why it actually makes sense that everybody has that cyber insurance, right? It preserves the E&O insurance for what it really should be there for, which is, the MSP, there's an error, there's an omission, they made an honest mistake, they screwed something up. I mean, it happens, we're all humans, right? MSPs don't want to have that E&O policy there to try and make sure that all of their clients are made whole again if their employee does something dumb.
Yeah. And what can MSPs do after putting that clause in that they take the clients take the responsibility? What can they do to sort of recommend that the client trains their staff properly on this? Or do you see the MSP providing this training, or is it the client company's responsibility to provide this training, or somewhere in between? But where does this sort of you know you have the best practices. You teach all the staff at your clients to, you at least tell them that they need to have a secure password that they're not using somewhere else. You tell them that they should be you force them to adopt an MFA and all that stuff, and still
Sure.
bad stuff can happen. But where does this sort of liability go in terms of actually training the staff, and would that be something that you would put in the contract?
So are you talking about like security awareness training?
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
that makes a
So
huge difference, obviously, in the case
Mhm.
of the accounts department wiring $500,000 somewhere, right?
Precisely. So actually, I have a couple videos on my YouTube channel about security awareness training specifically. There's a couple considerations there, and this is where I think, once again, I guess to kind of like hawk my book, it's free, so people can just download it. I'm not going to inundate you with insurance nonsense, but part of it is I think MSP should really start getting kind of savvy on what those particular cybersecurity and privacy laws say, because in a lot of regards, like you could make a very strong argument, and I do this all the time when I'm talking to clients of MSPs, where it's, hey, yeah, security awareness training, it's a really good idea, right? Obviously we know that, they probably even know that, but then there's always that hurdle of like, oh, well, it costs a couple bucks per user per month. Well, then adding into that conversation, we're not giving legal advice here, but it may also be a legal requirement that you do this. So the last thing you want to do is have your name in the local news or the national news on some regulator's website because something bad happened. They came in, you didn't have, say, the statutory requirements for controls that are in place, right? So there's a bunch of stuff out there where I think if MSPs, if they read my book or if they start digging into the case law, they could really make a strong recommendation to clients. And at the end of the day, it's really just for the benefit of the client, right? So not only is it, part of that defense in depth strategy for the MSP, but it's also really good for the client because they probably have not paid for, a privacy attorney to come in and actually assess their regulatory requirements. So not that the MSP should be giving any legal advice, but it's like, hey, if you fall under Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, or if you have a client in Massachusetts or a single client that's a resident of New York, here's some of the things that these laws say that, you have to do. As the MSP, I can't make you do that, but that's a risk consideration for the business. And when they start looking at the potential regulatory fines and penalties, it's a different conversation. And I will say, on the insurance side, the cyber insurance side, neither I nor anybody else I know can tell you if that's actually covered by cyber insurance. Like, we just don't know, frankly. And it depends on who brings that claim against the business, what type of claim they bring, right? Like, what statutes that attorney general is bringing into play here. Like, we don't know, right?
Yeah.
It hasn't been litigated yet. So I can't, on the cyber insurance side, like, I can't tell you, oh yeah, 201 CMR 17 out of Massachusetts, that'll be covered. But like, New York Shield Act is not going to be covered. We just can't do that yet. So I guess that's a whole different conversation on the limits of cyber insurance, but that is one of the limits there, where even if your client has that cyber insurance, um, they should be very cognizant of the fact that it's where insurable by law. That is the operative clause that they should understand. And where that's insurable by law, taking it from a guy, I've spent, thousands of hours trying to figure that out. I have no idea. And no other attorney I know that is truly giving legal advice in this sphere has any idea either. So that's just one example of where, understanding the kind of more of the legal side of it can be very beneficial.
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of a security policy for MSP technicians, help desk, and stuff like that, this is something that I've thought a lot about because we run a 24/7 after-hour service, basically,
Mm-hmm.
where we'll have to take calls on behalf of our MSPs. So maybe there's like 4 of them on the service at one time, and
Mm-hmm.
my technicians will have access to the MSP stack. But
Mm-hmm.
then people are calling in after hours. It could be, I don't know, Sunday morning at 6 a.m. and somebody calls in and says, the I'm the CEO of this company. I need to reset my email password. How do you verify that this person actually is who they say they are as a technician, And I thought about this a lot because, well, I asked all of my MSP now in our onboarding, what we do when we're providing staff to MSPs, we ask them, do you
Mm-hmm.
have a written security policy that defines how your technicians are supposed to abide by? And very few of the MSPs actually do have a written security policy that their technicians are supposed to follow. So if they did have one, what would be the best things from a legal standpoint or from your perspective and your experience to have in there for technicians to follow when dealing with end users at the
Oh man,
clients?
that's a great question. I think from like the truly deep legal perspective, that's a great question for Don Geider.
Okay.
But you are correct. That's a very hard problem to solve, right?
I
Is
mean,
like, how do you even validate someone's identity
well,
when
we
they're
cell phone numbers is the way that we've defaulted to.
Mhm.
Whereas, like for the 24-hour service, we have to have all of our MSP clients go to all of their clients and keep an updated list of everybody's cell phone number, so that when they,
Mhm.
if they don't, if there's any doubt that they are who they say they are, it's like, hey, I'm going to call you back on the number ending in these 4 digits. Can you answer the phone and just verify
Mhm.
that way? That's
Yeah,
one really good way.
I'd also add in that there's various additional levels of controls that you could probably put in place there.
Yeah.
So there could be like a video chat option.
Yeah.
So you could identify the user there. You could also have, say, some like predetermined passcode or password that you could implement as well.
Yeah.
And, part of that whole thing is, yes, there is a potential that your client will forget the passcode, forget the password, be very, very annoyed at that because he's got to do something specific. So you kind of have to talk through it with the client, um, I think kind of a standard practice would be a good idea.
Yeah.
Talking through to the client, be like, okay, it's like anything else in cybersecurity, right? Like, it's going to make your information harder to get to. And I understand that it could be an annoyance. It may take an extra 30 seconds. There may be some specific one-off where you really had to get to something, but you forgot the passcode. And so it's going to have to wait till the next day,
Yeah.
but it's really for your own good,
And we also
right?
have to have lists of approved users at the hours that they're
Mhm.
available. If somebody's the approved user, like the office manager or someone at the company, they're going to be available from 7 till 10 every day to take calls on, is this person actually legitimate who's calling in and stuff like that. And if there's any doubt, it's like, no, that's got to stay until the next day, next working day when the MSP is back. We'll escalate that ticket. So, and I think that
Yeah.
every MSP has to have a policy where their techs do that, kind of put things on hold and say, hey, as annoying as it might be to an end user, sometimes you have to
Yes.
say, no, I can't service this ticket right now because, well, I don't really have a way of verifying that you are who you say you are. And there's also stuff that happens like permissions to other people's mailboxes, shared folders on the internet, and all that sort of stuff where people can call in. And if you don't train the techs on this stuff, then they might just service a ticket that they really have no business servicing, like
Mhm.
somebody might have got wind that they were getting fired and all that stuff. I mean, it's a rare incidence, but you need to sort of prepare for this from a security standpoint. And I feel like a lot of MSPs like just have so much trust with between them, their techs, and their clients that this is
Mhm.
kind of like something that just easily gets overlooked.
And on there's also that consideration too that even on my end for insurance, which is a lot more mundane than a lot of what MSPs are doing, um, like we always have a central point of contact for every business. So we may
Yes,
get requests from random people, and they may be entirely legitimate. But if there's ever a question in our mind, we always have that central point of contact that we can go back to, right? It may be the CEO of the company or the CFO or whoever it is, right? And we may say, hey, we got this request from this person in your office, right? Can you just validate that that's correct, like
exactly.
that
So
that's
we
what you
have
want?
that, yeah, on our 24/7 client master sheet. And
Mhm.
yeah, it's like, yeah, these are the approvers in the organization, and this is when they're available. And if it's between those hours when they're not available, then you have to put them on hold if it's anything that requires a mailbox permission or access to data that they didn't previously have access to, or an access to an
Mhm.
account that you can't verify that they are who
Yep,
they say they
precisely.
are. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and that whoever that point of contact is, they should have a lot more insight, right? So if they're a big company and they have to call like whoever that division manager is, who then calls that person to validate, like, hey, this is legitimate. I think that's a really good idea.
yeah,
Just as because the last thing you want to do as an MSP, right, is give access to somebody who's not supposed to have it, and now all of a sudden your client is facing huge potential liability costs for that. And then, yeah, that's a great claim for negligence, gross negligence, et cetera. And that's where that E&O policy would definitely come into play.
yeah. So what about endpoint security? Have you seen breaches for MSPs and their clients coming from like malware on, devices that could be like used, like now that we're going into the world of home working a little bit more, people
Mhm.
might occasionally be using their home devices to access stuff. Have you seen any breaches coming from that?
We have, yeah. So we have seen um, a fairly sizable spike in remote worker breaches.
Hmm.
And it's entirely understandable why that is, right? Because how many people have changed the default password on their router ever? Like probably, half of 1% maybe.
Yeah, and
Um,
whatever home life is and work life have gone like this over the last year. So,
yeah, and
and
it's a hard problem. And it's obviously like there's kind of like workarounds with that with like VPNs and RDPs and kind of like setting it up that way. But at the end of the day, part of the other kind of like side of this equation that we're seeing is people working from home. There's kids screaming in the background, there's dogs barking, there's maybe their spouse got laid off, right? So there's like all this additional stress that's just part of the whole equation. And then the ability for that person to recognize something that's legitimate or not legitimate, right?
Hmm.
Or to see the difference in, the email coming from someone, it looks like it's legit, but instead of like a letter M, it's an R and an N, like closely spaced together. I think that's part of the equation too, where companies have to realize, that they're going to have to spend more money on security. So not just security awareness training, but obviously a great idea, but also that like the ability for your employees to process that information in a more stressful, loud, chaotic environment has gone down, right?
And the
So,
fact you might step away from your machine for a few minutes and your 9-year-old goes on there and starts downloading a bunch of stuff.
oh, precise, yeah. Or there's a really funny video out there on this attorney who shows up to a Zoom meeting
The
for
I am
court,
not a
and and he looks like a cat, and he had no idea how to get rid of that.
yeah.
That's kind of like a funny example, but yeah, it's like you previously, like you kind of had your castle and you could put the moat around your castle, and the castle was your office, and you could generally kind of control like what happened on those computer systems, what didn't happen. You could block like Facebook or Reddit or whatever the case may be. If it's someone's home computer, that's an entirely different story. So yeah, I mean, we're definitely seeing issues there. And the other issue I think just businesses at large need to be aware of is, they may have a cyber policy because they're like, okay, yeah, this is going to be a problem. Well, they need to make sure that that cyber policy would actually even cover a breach from, let's say, a home device. And that actually just gets into the definition of what is a computer system, right? So, cyber insurance companies, like, yeah, they're parsing this language now because they're losing money just hand over fist. I mean, they're just getting decimated in the marketplace. They're shelling out big dollars for these breaches. So, when you have a breach that comes from some remote device somewhere, there's a lot of crazy legal issues and practical issues that go into that. Like, can you take someone's personal device from their home if they're using it for work purposes? Like, can you run forensics on that? Like,
Yeah.
can you confiscate that device? If you're going to do that, like, how do you even get that device to run forensics on it, right? Like, if you're going to mirror the drive, like, how do you even do that
Well, it'd
on
have to be
someone's
in
like home computer?
the company's contracts with their employees, right? That they
Mhm.
would have that right. Is it possible to transfer that right?
It depends. It's very tricky to do, right? So even something like let's say, like BYOD was such a big deal. I guess it still is, but it really depends. So employment law, I've written on it. It's super complicated. I mean, even down to like the locality, they all have different laws. And that's really like an employment attorney is going to be a business's best friend there, because it just really depends. So, if a business is in a position where they can provide cell phones, laptops, tablets, whatever,
Of course they should, yeah.
yeah, personal PCs, like there's a very good argument there um, about what they can dictate happens on that device or not. But if it's someone's personal device, that's an entirely different story. And it really gets into this strange gray area where, the case law may not even be established yet.
And I'm
And
guessing
so,
that, yeah, from an MSP's perspective, right now is
mhm.
as good a time, is the best time to write all of your clients a proposal and a warning that people's home devices are not secure, and that you recommend that they purchase
Mhm.
work laptops for every employee who's working from home, and that they're aware that the consequences might be bad if they don't, you know?
Yeah, which actually brings us to kind of a different topic that I thought we should bring up, which is using what I call offensive documentation, which really gets into this idea of defense in depth from like a risk management perspective, like a business risk management perspective for the MSP. And it's things where, previously we talked about the contract, right? Which is contractually requiring cyber insurance, always offering an additional level of service, the check yes or no box for like the super high risk clients. It also gets into like the newsletter or like scam alerts where, all these MSPs out there that are going to be listening to this, they probably have an accountant or a business attorney, and every like month or so they get some newsletter, and their accountant may send them a newsletter that's like, hey, here's the update on IRS circular, 242 or something. And the business owner, right, they're probably wondering this whole time. They're like, why do they send me this nonsense? Like, I'm not going to read it. Even if I read it, I may not understand it. Like, what's the point in that? It's it's defense in depth for those professional services firms. And I think that's a great thing that an MSP can take and adopt for their own, because now you're building up that defense in depth where it's not only like, hey, we offer this additional service, you didn't want to do it, but hey, also we warned you over a long period of time that these types of things could happen. And they can tie that in with, hey, here's this like awful thing that happened to this business, right? Like, here's this additional service. If you don't already have it, like, we can talk about it that may mitigate this particular type of failure or breach. Contact us if you want to talk about it. And so over time, like, that's just documentation for the defense attorney to be like, this is magical, right? And we've had claims where businesses have done that. Not an MSP claim yet, because they're still kind of like getting into this mindset. But other types of clients we've had where they're like, oh yeah, here's 6 years of newsletters where we warned about this specific thing. And when it comes to defending your claim, right? When it comes to defending your business as an MSP, your defense attorney will hug you and buy you a very expensive bottle of whiskey because it's like gold raining down on them. I mean,
Yeah,
it's magical.
when I'm consulting for new MSPs, if we're gonna onboard them as a client, if they say our documentation is on SharePoint, I go, wait a second, I need to take a look at this. And if
Mhm.
their passwords are in plain text on SharePoint, it's like I make sure that I have a recorded Zoom call of me telling them, like, this is not secure. You should
Mhm.
have something that at least logs every password and who's accessed it, account by account, and all that stuff, because otherwise this is not secure, because it's plain text and you don't know who's had visibility of what. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of MSPs are not changing all their passwords whenever
Mhm.
employee gets offboarded.
Yeah,
I'm
and
almost
that's
sure. Yeah. So yeah.
and something like that is pretty standard practice for kind of like the broader business community as well.
Yeah.
Where it's really basic things like, hey, if you're going to fire an employee, right, like their access gets locked down from when they're walking from their desk to the office, or if they're in the office getting fired, like their access is locked down. um I think MSPs like just bring all that kind of stuff on board, right? And it's not even necessarily that you don't trust your employees, but it's just kind of a good business practice where maybe 5 years from now, you've had this policy in place this whole time and you just hired a bad egg,
Yeah.
like that'll save your business. That could be the deciding factor there. So you never know. So yeah, you're entirely correct.
Yeah, and yes, because a lot of MSPs don't do what is actually the best practice for security, is like have a separate. Well, the absolute best practice would be to have a separate admin password for each of their clients, for each of their
Mhm.
technicians. But that's a little unrealistic. The nice middle ground, I think, would be sort of have a password that technicians use to access each client's admin panel, and then
Mhm.
a service account where all the service one, because the problem is like system services and stuff like that might run on domain admin access level. And basically, if you
Sure.
have that protected, so all the services keep running, you can change that admin password to the clients every month if you want, and you can automate that even, and
Mhm.
automatically push that to the documentation system and stuff like that, and just keep it so whatever a tech has seen, because it's not just the tech's access to the RMM, it's not just the tech's access to the basically like tool set of the MSP. It's also if this tech remembers the Wi-Fi password of one of your clients, then and the domain admin password, they could go and stand outside the office and get into the server and delete everything, basically.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. And, MSPs really have to start thinking now, and this hasn't been the case for decades, but now obviously the tide is shifting. They really need to start thinking about, okay, if I end up at, say, the wrong end of a very long table and I have to explain to a bunch of regulators why I did or didn't do something, or if I'm in court and I'm sitting on the stand and I have to testify and I'm just getting grilled by some defense or some plaintiff's attorney, right? Like, they really need to start thinking about, okay, what did I have in place, right? Like, what reasonable steps did I try and implement? and trying to explain like why you didn't do something like you just explained, that would be really hard to do, because the plaintiff's attorney is going to ask, okay, did you do X, Y, and Z like Eric recommended? And you're like, well, no. Okay, well, how much would that have cost to implement that? Right. And you're like, free to $100 a month or something. And he's going to go, okay, so you thought for $100 a month that you didn't have to secure the access to my client's system in the probability or the event that this went down.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're entirely correct there. And it's all about starting to think defensively there about your MSP, to be like, okay, if we get put in a bad position, how do we explain that we did everything we reasonably could to try and secure our system and the systems of our clients?
This is all making me think of doing something I've been thinking for a while, which is like basically just doing a security audit of every MSP we bring on board, just to cover our side of things, to make sure that, we've at least made the recommendations of having a system like that that has, at least logging of who's seen
Mm-hmm.
what password and changing those, and actually getting the MSPs to sign, yep, we're doing this, yep, we're doing this, yep, we're doing this, yep, we're doing this, or we're not doing this, and that they accept the liability of that. So that's very interesting. And MSP should absolutely do the same with their clients. And
Mm-hmm.
it's just, this is a huge blind spot in MSP, in the MSP space, basically, because it just it's the last thing people, it's like the skeletons in your closet, basically, that you don't want to just
Yeah.
open up and look at any time. It's kind of the things like, oh, you just cross your fingers, hope nothing bad happens, and there's so much you could do in the
Mm-hmm.
meantime to ensure that if something, that bad things don't happen, and if they do happen, you've at least warned other people. And yeah, so
Yeah. And it's one of those things where, like, I mean, I get it, right? So like, as a former IT myself, like, I never wanted someone in my system looking at my policies, procedures, and controls and calling my baby ugly, right? Because
yeah,
it's like,
yeah,
that
yeah,
thing is my baby. But I think MSPs need to kind of shift that mindset and start thinking, okay, who is going to call my baby ugly, right? Do I want a guy who's on my team looking out for my best interest, saying, hey, your baby's kind of ugly in these particular areas, right? And saying like, okay, thanks. Yeah, let's fix it. Or do you want a regulator, a state attorney general? Do you want a federal regulator? Do you want a plaintiff's attorney, calling you out when you're sitting on the hot seat in court? Or do you want your own defense attorney going, I can't believe you didn't do these basic things. Like, what were you thinking? How are we going to explain this? So it's me personally. I would rather have somebody on my team calling my baby ugly than someone who's not on my team who wants a sizable amount of money
and
trying to
yeah,
call my baby
that's
ugly.
exactly what I like to do with our business already, providing staff. As soon as we provide staff, we become aware of all these sorts of inefficiencies in the organization that we've seen other
Mhm.
clients actually deal with really well, and we can come in and make those recommendations. So it works really well when we have a client who's super receptive and is like, wow, you've got 35 MSP clients, what can we learn from what you've learned working with them, and all
Mhm.
that stuff. But some of them, yeah, they're convinced that they've already got everything figured out and don't want to hear it. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's selecting your clients. And I'm saying this because it extends to the MSPs and their clients,
Mhm.
that they need to see that they are actually the trusted experts. I made a video the other day, how to be a premium MSP. And
Sure.
basically it is one of the big things, is one of the top things is hire clients that actually value your advice and want to pay your premium price. Because the
Mhm.
clients who don't want to pay a premium price are the ones who are most likely to question your advice, if that makes
Oh,
sense. Yeah.
and I'd say, just in my experience, the most likely to sue you and the most likely just to try and nickel and dime you to death, be a constant pain. Um, so I understand that, a lot of MSPs are still, compared to other industries, like very small, right? Like most of the industry is under 5 million in revenue. So like, I get it. So, think about like the same thing. If you're an MSP and you're listening, think about the same thing you would tell your client, right? If you're like, hey, here's all these additional controls you need to put in place, right? And they look at it and they're like, their head explodes and they get sticker shock and they're like, oh my God, this is going to be expensive, right? So it's like, okay, well, at the very least, like, let's have a plan of implementation, right? So maybe we can't do all this right now because it's just too expensive, right? Like, you just don't have the funds to do that. Well, at the very least, like, let's write a plan down on when you're going to implement it. right? Let's kind of rank order what we think your highest risks are, how we mitigate those. That'll be part of our implementation process, right? And let's at least just start working on the problem, right? So instead of saying like, oh my God, I'm just going to ignore this and hope nothing happens, let's just have a plan in place so we can, very systematically start increasing that security.
At least knock down the low hanging fruit. What's easy to fix now? Yeah.
Precisely. And, it's one of those things where, once again, if a regulator comes knocking, or a plaintiff's attorney comes knocking on your door and he's like, why didn't you do this? It's, well, we were going to do this, right? Given financial constraints that our business had, right? Like, we knew that we needed to do this and we were working towards that end goal, right? And that I think will really go a long way to helping the case for all those MSPs.
So did you follow the situation a couple of years ago in Europe with GDPR and how they were implementing that?
Yeah, GDPR has been kind of a train wreck from my perspective. It's just been like it's gotten into areas where like it just never should have gotten into. It's been, I mean, just crazy expensive to implement. But yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So anyways, what happened 2 years ago, like at the start of 2019, I think it was, we started consulting on GDPR for our MSP clients because we realized that we could actually help their clients
Mm-hmm.
knock down the low hanging fruit of what it takes to get their clients and get their staff doing a basic amount of security and understanding and training them for what it actually means to respect people's data rights, because
Mm-hmm.
most of it was about individual users' data rights, right? So
Sure.
basically we put together a package where we trained the staff and looked at the systems and saw a bunch of weaknesses. But in putting together this package, I reached out to cybersecurity experts, to lawyers, and to to our existing MSP clients. And what I
Mm-hmm.
really realized is that the cybersecurity people were only on the dimension of security, and the lawyers were only on the dimension of law. And it was like I was talking to two completely different worlds. And the
Oh, sure.
cybersecurity were just, yeah, we can bill, this amount of money to go in and put it in this security system and this one. And the lawyers were like, yeah, well, but they didn't really know that much about the technology. So how does a company like yours, a firm like yours, sort of bridge that gap between
Mm-hmm.
technology and actual legal stuff when you're doing the consultations and putting together a holistic strategy to cover both of them?
Part of it is, we kind of bring like three things to the table, right? So we bring the insurance side, the technical side, at least at a fundamental level. And obviously we don't give legal advice because we're just insurance guys, but
Yeah.
we're also saying like, kind of like what to us would be very, very basic. But to most firms out there is just like mind blowing.
Yeah.
So, most companies here in the US, like the way that our cybersecurity and privacy laws work, I mean, it's just a patchwork of insanity. So you could have state laws you have to adhere to, you could have sector laws you have to adhere to, and then federal laws you have to adhere to. Um, and then within that, you have to understand that here in the US, it's the breach notification law that applies to you, which may also have cybersecurity requirements in it. It it doesn't matter where your business is located. Like, that's irrelevant. It depends on where your clients are residents of, right? So like, let's say you're a business and you're right next to a military base here in the US, because we have them all over. You could technically have to adhere to all 50 different state and territory breach notification laws, which really just like blows the mind of most business owners at this point, because privacy law, at least on the legal side, that's really new here in the US. So it wasn't even considered like an established practice area under the American Bar Association up until like really a few years ago, maybe 3-4 years ago at this point. So there haven't really been a lot of attorneys that actually specialize in that area. Most of them are at like the big national law firms. And it's really only now starting to kind of like percolate down into like the regional, sometimes local law firms. The average like general business attorney that a business would have probably has no oversight on that particular area of the law. And I can tell you that because they call me all the time because they're trying to like start that practice area up and they're trying to figure out like where to even begin. to do that thing. So, part of it is like, obviously we're not giving legal advice, but I have a whole series of questions that we go through with that client, right, to try and uncover not just from the cyber insurance side, right? Because even on cyber insurance, it's like that business rarely knows what they actually need or what their risks are, right? So I'm trying to see, okay, what are the risks they care about, but what are the risks that I think they should care about that they don't even know about, right? So that business may not even understand that there's coverage for cryptojacking or bricking or voluntary shutdown or dependent business interruption or loss of contract, like et cetera, et cetera. But going through that, so it's both the insurance side, then part of it is like me trying to see how comfortable I am with that particular company, right? So there's kind of some heuristics, like some rules of thumb that I've developed. So one would be, for example, hey, are you doing security awareness training, right? Yes or no? And let's say they're like, sure. So I'm like, okay, can you tell me the difference between phishing and whaling, right? So even if they're doing that security awareness training, if the person on the other end of the phone can't just quickly tell me the difference between phishing and whaling, which for us is like pretty straightforward. If they can't do that, then I'm like, okay, little less comfort with that client, right? That has different implications there. Or if they say, hey, um, we don't even do security awareness training. We just tell our people not to click on the wrong thing, which is what I hear, thankfully less frequently now, but has been fairly common. Then it's a quick discussion on, okay, well, you said you're holding social security numbers, driver's license numbers, et cetera, et cetera. Right. Well, you may want to think about talking to your attorney about, say, this specific law because it says this thing. And here's a court case where that thing has gone wrong. And here's what happened to that business who didn't implement this thing. And by the way, I can't promise you that cyber insurance would even cover that. So that's like kind of part of it. So it's recommending really, unfortunately, I'd say like, most clients that I talk to on the cyber insurance side, we don't even get to the point about talking about like, the really fun, technical, super in-depth cybersecurity stuff because they're still missing so many of those fundamentals, um, that, it's like, I get to be the guy where, I get to say like, hey, I don't make any more or less money either way if you implement this thing that your MSP has probably been recommending for years, but it's a really good idea. It may be a legal requirement. And oh, by the way, I've seen where this went wrong when companies didn't do this. So I'd highly recommend you look into implementing that thing. And that's been, for me, I personally, I really enjoy doing that because, last year alone, my firm dealt with like 2 breaches a week. Right. So I get to see the fallout of what happens when people don't do really the fundamentals. And, these are real people with real lives. They employ real humans, that's putting like food on the table for families. And when that goes south, like it is not a fun experience to be part of. So, it's like, I want to do everything I can, much like the MSP does, right? Where it's, I want to do everything I can so that on the insurance side, you only have to talk to me once a year,
So
right?
you're
If we're
like
talking,
the cop who knows what it looks like when somebody doesn't wear their seatbelt.
yeah. And I've got stories galore of businesses, and it's generally like I can tell people, oh, yeah, last month I dealt with this specific thing. Yesterday I dealt with this specific failure. Um, hey, here's a recent case where this law has been put in play. Here's some terrible things that have happened. So, in some cases here in the US, it's like, hey, if the FTC comes after you, like you're looking at 20-year consent orders, right? Like I would not want to be a business where for the next 2 decades, I have to comply with this laundry list of like 20 cybersecurity controls where the FTC has to look over it and you have to do all this documentation. It's just, you'd have to hire someone like just to do that thing inside of your business. And oh, by the way, all the vendors you're going to use, they're going to charge you an arm and a leg because they don't want the FTC coming after them, right? Or they don't want the FTC going back to their client saying, no, this isn't legit, because now they have more exposure. So, I mean, it's just expensive all around. But yeah, to answer your question, sorry, in a very long-winded way there. Yeah, I actually really enjoy talking to those clients, dealing with the cyber insurance side, trying to make them safer. They don't always take my recommendation, but I do the best I can to advise them on what to do there.
Yeah, so the US has a reputation of being the most litigious society in the world, actually.
Hmm.
And yeah, so I mean, for US companies, you have to be on top of the ball. You have to be on top of the law, or else the law is going to get on top of you. That's pretty much how it goes, right?
Yeah, and at this point, a lot of businesses out there, they're like, "Oh my gosh, this is so complex." It's like cybersecurity, right? It's the same thing they're seeing on the cybersecurity law side. Is this is so complex? It's so overwhelming. I don't even know where to start. I'm just going to bury my head in the sand, work on the other problems for my business. Well,
So yeah,
just like cybersecurity, it's only going to get worse. It's only getting worse.
so
There are.
let's go with the basics. I mean, yeah, I'm sure you have lots of horror stories, but what can MSPs do today
Mhm.
to actually put better security? What are the top five things? Because we went off on a few tangents when I asked this, but like if we
Sure.
you can just give me a short list of the things that you think that they could do this year to help themselves out.
Okay, so you're talking about the security within the MSP?
Both with the clients and with the MSP, just to overall protect bad things happening, like put a, stop the evil
Mhm.
eye from piercing their organization. What's the
Sure. Well,
what's the ritual, and yeah, what are the simple
mhm.
things if we want to give someone a takeaway from this talk?
Okay, so the takeaway, like risk management, kind of like cybersecurity side would be defense in depth, right? We talked about that. Having a tech E&O policy, making sure it's appropriate for your business.
Yeah,
That's going to be huge. Contractually requiring that cyber insurance, that's going to be a big deal. As for their clients, it's fun for us as technical people to talk about the latest like AI driven machine learning super algorithm that does all these fancy things in a business. Frankly, the vast majority of breaches I see,
human, right?
yeah, it's just human and just a total, not even a failure of basic controls, just a lack of basic controls.
And basic awareness, yeah.
Yeah, so they didn't have security awareness training. They didn't have 2FA or MFA. They weren't doing any sort of like dark web or deep web monitoring. They have no idea what laws they may fall under, and they've never been advised on that. They didn't even have backups, or they had one backup and it wasn't a 3-2-1 backup strategy, or they didn't have MFA on their backup. So a lot of it is, it's fun to talk about the super technical side of it. But for 99% of those clients of MSPs, it's let's just get the basics,
Yeah, so get
right?
it in the contract, get the end users educated about what they have to do, and hold them accountable for things like MFAs.
Yeah, and I would say if an MSP has a client, and at this point, if they're like, I refuse to do multiple backups, I refuse to pay for security awareness training, I refuse to pay for, two-factor or multi-factor authentication, all those basics. If you're an MSP out there, I would really question if that client should be your client in the future, because like you are just setting yourself up for disaster. Like an engineering firm would never have a client who's like, no, I'm not going to build in this safety threshold. It's going to be more expensive. Like it just wouldn't happen. An accounting firm would never have a client who said, no, I'm just not going to file a tax return.
I actually have a
It,
saying which I think is very applicable in this as an example. If most MSPs were airlines, you wouldn't want to fly on them.
yeah, yeah. And it's, MSPs, I think they just need to look at, from the risk management side, we talked about that, like kind of best business practices, but also looking internally and thinking like, okay, if I'm recommending to my client that they have security awareness training, that they have 2FA, MFA, that I have multiple backups, that they're adhering to a framework, all those basics that an MSP is saying that they recommend for their clients, like, are they implementing those within their own business? And I think that's really going to go a long way. And I think it's going to become even more important in the future. So they might as well start now.
Yeah.
It's going to become even more important in the future as the lawsuits ramp up, the breaches ramp up, people remain, this work from home because it's more convenient for some specific circumstances, or it's cheaper for the business to have people work from home so they don't have a huge office. Um, I only see tech insurance becoming more expensive. We're already seeing providers of tech insurance for MSPs just leaving the market entirely, right? And you got to think like they have at that level, they have a bunch of very smart people and a whole lot of data and historical data. And they're saying, this is too risky. We are just going to lose money on this. We're out. So I think that should be the red flag for those MSPs out there to say, well, the risk is here. It's only going to get higher. The big brains at these large multi-billion-dollar multinational corporations are saying it's too risky. That should be the red flag for those MSPs out there to say, okay, maybe I need to take a step back from working for my business for a couple of days, and let's work on my business for a couple of days, and let's try and make sure we're set up for success in the future.
Yeah. Well, great. I think there's a lot in this. I guess it's about 1 hour now that we've talked. So I think we've left some pretty good takeaways. So thanks very much for your time and explaining all this. We're going to be, I'm putting the link in the description on how people can reach you. And
Good deal.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And yeah, tell us just before you leave a little bit more about how you approach new clients and how you sign them on and how they can work with you.
Yeah. So, kind of like as a broad rule, I will help everybody, whether I'm licensed in their state, I do that line of insurance or not. We just have a general rule here that, we're going to help everybody we can, because it's just good for the world at large to
Yep.
do that.
Yep.
So pretty much like anybody can reach out to me. We only work here in the United States. We're licensed in a ton of different states, which I won't list them all out. It just, kind of depends. But we're here to help anybody. The onboarding process is really me talking with that client, seeing how comfortable I am with them, what their particular concerns are. It's different for an MSP versus, say, just like a normal business trying to get cyber insurance. Obviously because the MSPs are a lot more technical, so they kind of got that side wired a little tighter than the average business will. But it's really just me getting to know that client, what their risks are, what their risk tolerance would be, and just kind of, advising them on a lot of the stuff that we've talked about here, right? So, I don't get paid any for talking about like the risk management side, but, we try to help those MSPs and all the businesses we can to make sure that they're staying out of trouble. So I've got a lot of videos on my YouTube channel. So
Yep.
if someone
We'll put a
just
link
searches
there.
for my
Yep.
name,
Yep.
yeah, there's a ton of videos I've put on there on, even how to comply with insurance, how to avoid the most common declination of coverage after they get that policy in place. So I'm putting about a new video out every week to try and help all those businesses out there, all really centered around cyber insurance, cybersecurity law, the latest, greatest that's going on. And then I will have an update to my book, Damage Control, Cyber Insurance and Compliance. That'll be maybe 6 months from now. That's a large pill to swallow to do that much writing. Because I was a technical guy. I wasn't an English major. But yeah, there'll be updates to the book, and we'll be doing updates for probably a new video for the next 50 years at this point, every week.
Great. Well, thanks a lot for the time. I really enjoyed talking to you, and this has been MSP Mountain, folks. Thanks, Joseph.
Thanks, Eric.